We'll do it in 2 parts.
Bullshit.
Oh, we're live. 0 viewers. Don't think it's up on YouTube yet, so we'll wait a little bit for things to get settled, people to figure it out.
All right. Now, how do you restrict it so people can't join in the session?
I think that's what the Hangouts on Air is. I'm pretty sure only you guys can. Because it says, see how it says viewers down there? Or do you have that?
Nope. It must be just from the admin panel for you.
Oh, okay. See, well, right now it says 0, so that's a bad sign. I think it's still processing.
There should be, well, that link that you shared, that was the right link, right?
That was what it gives me. I hope it's the right link. Let's
Okay. Well, we can test that by just opening up that browser.
Yeah, it says it's on live.
Correct. Okay.
I'm going to see what it looks like on mobile, but it says it's on live when I go to it. So.
Yeah, let me see.
Like it works on my computer is what I'm trying to say.
It'd be really funny if we're having this conversation and people are saying, "Hey, assholes, you're totally live right now."
Well, we are live. I'm just trying to wait for, the viewers to trickle in. Okay. Sorry, that wasn't the confusion. I know we're live. We just there we go. I think viewers are trickling in now. We'll give it a minute or 2.
Okay. I just clicked and it's the right link. Okay, cool.
Does it work on mobile? I've been worried about that.
I don't know.
I will check now. This is live testing. Oh, don't tell me that doesn't work on mobile.
I don't see it.
Yeah, it works on computer but not mobile. It's really, really interesting. I don't know why Google would do that. So maybe I'll try to tweet the YouTube page for mobile real quick. Well, hello everyone watching. We're just making sure people can trickle in here.
I'm pretty sure the link is. Well, people who are watching on mobile. That means they're out of the house and they didn't schedule the proper time to watch the debate, which means they're not committed. Which means that we don't need to bend over backwards for that.
Hey, I just want as many people to see this as can. So we've definitely got enough viewers going now that I think. What do you think about getting started, guys?
That's fine.
What do you think?
Fine with me.
All right. Well, I'd like to officially kick this off. Welcome to the first ever live debate hosted by the Atheistically Speaking Podcast. I'm your host, Thomas Smith. I'll be lightly moderating things, very gently, passively moderating things, maybe passive-aggressively. Maybe I can give things like, you sure you want to use all that time? Okay. All right. Have you ever had a passive-aggressive moderator? I don't know. Anyway, the proposition up for debate today is the following. The intensity and widespread nature of suffering is significant evidence against God. Now, note that the debaters are not debating whether or not God exists per se, but whether or not suffering is specifically evidence against God. Now, arguing for the motion is Justin Schieber. Hello, Justin.
Hello.
Justin is currently the host of Real Atheology. That's a philosophy of religion YouTube channel where they use big words that are so hard to say. Where he discusses important authors and arguments in contemporary philosophy of religion. Previously, Justin was co-host of the Reasonable Doubts radio show that just came to an end recently. I know a lot of people were really sad about that. But that was for 4 years. Justin enjoys promoting a friendly yet firm skepticism toward religious claims. He has lectured on the philosophical arguments for and against the existence of God and has participated in many public debates throughout the United States and Canada, so is pretty much famous. Arguing against the motion is Rob Johnson. How you doing today, Rob?
Doing pretty well.
All right. Rob is a Christian apologist from Lansing, Michigan. He currently runs the website apologetics105.com and hosts a weekly podcast by the same name where he engages with arguments for and against God, philosophy, and various theological matters. One of the central pillars of his ministry, both online and through the local church, is encouraging a fruitful and respectful dialogue between non-believers and Christians. He argues that faith is reasonable and should always be based on evidence. Well, we've certainly got some non-believers and believers here today, so we'll see if that fruitful, respectful dialogue works out. I'm rooting for it.
Me too.
So the format for this debate is as follows. 2 10-minute intros, starting with Justin, followed by a loosely timed sort of cross-examination and discussion period. Both debaters agreed that they wanted the chance to really engage with one another, so the format will be somewhat loose tonight because of that, or today, whatever your time zone is. I know that, by the way, in Australia, it's like some god-awful time. It's like 5 a.m., but I know, hello if we got any of those Australian viewers who I saw some commenting that they were definitely going to try to make it, so that's dedication. Thank you, guys. And after that will be a Q&A period. Now, please submit some questions, guys, as the debate goes along. You can submit them on Twitter using the hashtag #SufferingAndGod, or I think there's a Q&A app here on Google Hangouts, so you could also use that. So those will be the two places that I'll be looking. I probably won't see it if you send it anywhere else, so sorry. And after that question and answer period will be 5-minute closing remarks, starting with Rob and ending with Justin. So that's it. I'm very excited. And with that said, I would like to open up the floor to Justin to start his opening remarks.
All right. Excellent. First of all, I want to begin by thanking Thomas Smith and the Atheistically Speaking Podcast and my opponent in this debate, Robert Johnson. The issue of debate is one of suffering, and whether or not the arguments I'm about to attempt from observations about suffering in our world can provide us with significant evidence against God. The word significant there can be a bit distractingly vague, I'll admit. So what do I mean by that? Well, by significant evidence, I mean evidence which would be very foolish to leave out of our investigations. So sometimes, through limits in time or resources, we have to kind of limit the scope of evidence we look at, and sometimes we might ignore really trivial, very weak evidence. So all I'm saying is that significant evidence is the kind of evidence which we would not ever want to do that to. It seems then that Robert, my opponent in this debate, has a few strategies that he could adopt in successfully countering my central claim, which is that suffering is significant evidence against God. And one strategy might be to say that the facts to which my arguments refer are not actually evidence at all, let alone significant evidence. That they cannot serve as evidence against theism because of certain relevant epistemic limitations that we as humans suffer from. It might be argued that these limitations cast doubt on some of the inferences essential to my arguments. Another strategy might be to deny the empirical facts central to my argument. A valid argument is not a very useful argument if your opponent denies the empirical questions that are being assumed. Thirdly, a third strategy might be to agree that the facts to which I refer are evidence, but that they're not significant evidence. These facts are just very weak, he might claim. And so those are three general strategies my opponent might take. However, I hope to show that none of these strategies are without unwelcome implications. So in presenting these three arguments, I'll be defending a certain atheistic hypothesis, which philosopher Paul Draper calls the hypothesis of indifference. Articulating HI, Draper writes, quote, "Neither the nature nor the condition of sentient beings on Earth is the result of benevolent or malevolent actions performed by non-human persons," unquote. So Draper notes that the hypothesis of indifference, while consistent with supernaturalism, is not consistent with theism, because if supernatural beings do exist, then no actions performed by them is motivated by a direct concern for our well-being. So of course I'm defining theism here as classical theism, omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. Philosopher of science at Johns Hopkins University, Victor de Fate, writes, "The most widely accepted probabilistic account of evidence is the so-called increase in probability or positive relevance account. See, the idea here is simply that E is evidence for H if and only if E makes H more probable than it otherwise would have been. And so generally, evidence for indifference and against theism will be observations that are expected on the assumption that indifference is true, but rather surprising on the assumption that theism is true. The further apart these two conditionals are, the stronger the evidence is. I want to bring our attention to two observations that fit this description and so constitute significant evidence for indifference and against theism. In this, the first argument is apparently pointless suffering. In this argument, I'm willing to grant that God, if such a thing exists, may have reasons for allowing certain instances of suffering to occur in the actual world, perhaps to ensure some greater good, or to avoid some equally bad or worse instance of suffering. However, God, if he existed, would never allow an instance of suffering unless it was logically necessary for that greater good, or that equally bad or worse instance of suffering. But of course, now we get to the problem. Many instances of suffering that we see in our world, both by human and non-human animals, seem suspiciously like the exact kinds of suffering that a perfectly loving being would prevent if he did exist. They seem utterly pointless. Think of the Holocaust, think of slavery in the American South, think of ISIS. The usual response here is to argue that God gave us free will, and that our abuse of free will is just that, it's an abuse. Now, I agree that free will is important. Generally speaking, people should be allowed to make mistakes, learn, and grow accordingly. But however important free will is, we must recognize that it is not a trump card. Everybody in this room already knows this. Imagine you're walking down the street and you witness and you don't intervene, right? We would think that one would have a moral obligation to intervene. So if respecting the attacker's free will is not an adequate justification for us walking on by such a crime, why does this not also apply to God? Then, of course, you have natural suffering. Think of the central theory of biology, the theory of evolution by natural selection. It can only occur with massive amounts of suffering and death, most of which occurred long before humans entered the world stage. Notice that this is not just an accidental byproduct of evolution. This natural suffering and death is intrinsic to the system. Also in this category of natural suffering are things like earthquakes, tornadoes, droughts, floods, disease, and famine. This is all very real and deeply felt suffering. And so it seems quite obviously that this kind of suffering, the seemingly pointless kind, and the massive number of them, that on the assumption of theism, this is very surprising. But of course, the atheist or the indifferentist has no problem fitting these facts into their view. On indifference, the universe is indifferent to our suffering. On indifference, the universe is blind to our well-being. Therefore, the massive amount of seemingly pointless suffering in the world strongly favors indifference over theism. Or in the words of philosopher Robert Bass of UNC, suffering counts against the existence of God in the same way that crabgrass on the golf green counts against the existence of an efficient greenskeeper. The next argument appeals to facts about flourishing and languishing of sentient beings. And if there's anything obvious about the flourishing and languishing of sentient beings, it is the following three facts. First, that only a fraction of sentient beings have an adequate supply of food and water and are able to reproduce, avoid predators, and remain healthy at some point in their lives. Two, even fewer are able to do these things for most of their lives. And three, even fewer still are able to do these things for all of their lives. Now, premise one is going to be arguing that these three facts, jointly considered, are highly unlikely on the assumption that theism is true. So on theism, it seems quite obvious that sentient beings are at least supposed to flourish, and this is true for three reasons. First, as Paul Draper writes, almost all sentient beings are capable of flourishing on biologically realistic circumstances. Secondly, and to quote Paul Draper again, sentient organisms, because they have conscious desires and can feel pain and pleasure, are also capable of having lives that are good or bad. and the failure to flourish is incompatible with their having good lives. And lastly, a perfectly loving God would care greatly about his sentient loved ones having good lives, and would be in the perfect position and would have the requisite abilities to make it so. Premise 2 is that these facts about flourishing and languishing, these three facts, are highly likely on the assumption that indifference is true. This is because if indifference is true, and given that we are biological organisms, and that biological evolution must be true if that is true, then if biological evolution is true, all animals are in constant competition for resources and survival. So these three facts are entirely expected on indifference. Philosopher Paul Draper writes, "The fact that flourishing is rare and languishing or early death common is not only unsurprising, it is expected. Therefore, these three facts about flourishing and languishing strongly favor indifference over theism." Now, because my arguments are aimed at theism generally, it may be tempting to argue that when we add certain Christian-specific auxiliary hypotheses or doctrines to the core hypothesis of theism, that my evidential arguments will no longer work. However, this would be to misunderstand my evidential arguments, because one must do more than simply identify and add new claims to the core hypothesis, which could help explain these observations on the hypothesis of theism. One must also demonstrate for us tonight that there is an antecedent reason for thinking that these additional claims are actually more likely to be true given the core hypothesis, given theism, than their denial. So without such reasons or reason, without those reasons, my arguments would remain unscathed. This is because the question is not whether my observations
Your time is up. Please wrap.
Okay.
Finish that thought, sorry.
Those two arguments are what I'm proposing are significant evidence against theism.
Thank you very much. So thank you, Justin. All right, and with that, I'd like to hand it over to Rob for his opening statements. So I believe I can present you here, and you are good to go, Rob.
All right, well, thanks. First off, I want to thank Thomas for organizing the debate and getting this set up, as well as Justin for inviting me to participate in today's debate. I think it's important at the forefront to express differing versions of the problem of evil. That way we don't get caught up in mixing these up. So the first one that we need to look at is the logical version, which expresses that God and evil are logically incoherent, that it's impossible for God and evil to coexist. So that's not one we're talking about today. The second one is the emotional version, which I think is what the majority of people express whenever they invoke a problem of evil. They look at cancer or the Holocaust or someone getting hit by a car and trying to understand why God would allow that to happen. And they're not submitting any type of conclusion that results in therefore God doesn't exist. They're playing off of an emotional argument, and therefore it's not one we ought to take seriously in philosophical thought, but it's definitely one we need to look at from a psychological level and definitely a counseling level. The third one is what we're discussing today, is the probabilistic version, or also called the evidential version. And about this version, which basically states that a person would be claiming that God probably doesn't exist based on the amount of evil we see in the world. So based on that, there are three things I want to tackle in my opening. The first is that the Bible is consistent when answering the reason as to why we suffer. So if we were to adopt a worldview, and I'm not talking about presuppositionalism here, I'm just merely talking about if we were to adopt a Christian worldview. The first thing, we'd have an understanding between the difference of good and evil at an objective level. And to an onlooker, something like the crucifixion, for example, might seem pointless. It might be an event of seemingly pointless suffering. Someone would ask, well, why would someone who is innocent, by all accounts, and who has done nothing wrong, be tortured and beaten and have nails put through his wrists and hands and strung up on a cross? Why would that be the case? And this is an example of the immediate local details not explaining why suffering takes place. Again, this is in the context of Christianity. But what we see is that when Jesus died, it was to redeem the world. It was to offer salvation to all people. It was to show God's love through this sacrifice. So a greater good came out of something that was seemingly pointless at a local level. And lastly, on the Christian worldview, we would look at heaven. So heaven, if real, would outweigh and justify the suffering that we have on this earth. Because the chief purpose in life on the Christian worldview is not happiness, and it's not for people to achieve the most amount of money and happiness they can have. It's to express the knowledge of God and extend that view to all people who are in the world. That is the chief mission of the Christian. So it's not happiness, it's suffering and sacrificing to extend the message of the gospel to other people. The second thing I'd like to look at here is theodicy and skeptical theism. To pick up with theodicy, we can identify a greater good that has taken place in various circumstances of suffering. For example, freedom, natural law, and moral responsibility all may supersede suffering, and therefore suffering would be a byproduct of those things which are necessary. And this is endorsed by natural theologians such as Hick, Richard Swinburne, and Bob Adams, all of whom express this view. And it's just one that I think would answer this seemingly pointless suffering claim on the probabilistic version. The second area to look at under my second argument here is that if we were to pick up skeptical theism, we could look at this from that perspective and say that we should not be able to discern why an all-loving, knowing, and powerful God would permit suffering, and this would be based on a distinction between an infinite being, who would be God, and finite beings, which would be us in humanity. And this view is one that is held to by Van Wagen, Alston, and Dijkstra. And what they say is that we shouldn't be able to know why that's the case. So we shouldn't know why God would allow something to happen, because we are finite in our time, and He is timeless. He has an overseeing view that we just don't have. And let's say we were to pick up on a probabilistic version that's expressed by William Rowe and look at his version, which is widely used. Graham Oppy, who's not a Christian, states that Rowe's evidential arguments are unsuccessful and that he, quote, sees no reason why we should not say that this is just another of the many claims about which reasonable people can reasonably disagree. So the bottom line to this is that we don't have enough evidence to say one way or another, and I think at best it's a push to place probability on events without taking into account all variables and offshoots that would result from an event is misguided. Actually, in a lecture on the problem of evil, Dr. Bill Craig notes that, quote, every event sends a ripple effect through history so that the consequences of any event are incalculable and incomprehensible for a finite local person. So we see that if we were to just take a car accident, for instance, where a child died, we don't know the ripple effect that sends through time. Moreover, we don't know if that greater good would come about 400 years later and quite possibly on an entirely different continent. The third part I want to express to wrap here is Molinism, which is this idea that God has middle knowledge. So that is to say that logically prior to the divine decree, God knew what we would do in various sets of circumstances. He knew, for instance, whether or not Justin would have denied Peter 3 times if he were in Peter's shoes. He knows what he would have done. And based on that, God can order the world as He'd like, keeping our free will intact, as well as still being sovereign, still being in control. And if God wanted free will, primarily, in creatures with significant moral responsibility, then it seems to me that if that's the case, if He wanted those things to take place, that suffering or evil would be a byproduct of that, not being able to establish a world with free will and without evil. And if anyone wants to make a claim that says He could have done that, I would need to see a working model, because to date, no one has ever been able to do that. So I don't see any way where free will can exist and evil is gone or neutralized or anything like that in a way that's meaningful and coherent. And as I said, to date, no atheist has ever been able to show that to be the case. So to conclude here, the 3 points that I want to emphasize are, first, that the Bible is consistent when we are answering reasons as to why we suffer, adopting a Christian worldview. The second is that theodicy and skeptical theism can provide an answer to the problem of suffering, with a theodicy saying that things like freedom, natural law, and moral responsibility supersede suffering and potentially would cause a byproduct of suffering. And the second is skeptical theism, which says we wouldn't be able to discern why an all-loving, knowing, and powerful God would permit suffering based on him being infinite and us as humanity being finite. And finally, we would look at Molinism, which is the idea that we have libertarian free will and God has middle knowledge, where he can order the world based on the free choices of his creations and do what he wants by our free will choices, not determining us and not overriding our free will. So based on those three things, I don't find the probabilistic version of evil anyway meaningful and towards going to disprove God's existence. I think at best it's a push, and therefore we shouldn't use it, and we should look to other arguments that might support or deny the existence of God. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. A minute under time, so we've got a little time for me to say something quickly that I meant to say. Now, because Atheistically Speaking is, of course, mainly an atheist-centric podcast, I think a lot of our viewers are coming from that perspective. So I'd like to encourage you, thank you for all the questions that I already see flooding in. I really appreciate that. If there's anyone viewing who has a question that's maybe from the Christian perspective or from the theist perspective, I encourage you, please ask that question, because we're going to naturally have a bit of an imbalance given the audience. So I just want to try to make sure we can try to keep things balanced. So please, if possible, if anyone has questions more geared toward Justin and toward his claims, that would be much appreciated. So with that said, I think we shall begin the informal kind of, what are we calling it, I suppose, just discussion period, a bit of a cross-examination period. I'll go ahead and hand that off to Justin to begin.
Okay. Well, I have some questions, but Robert, do you have any that you'd like to start off with?
Are you leading this time with your questions, or am I doing it with mine?
We didn't decide, so you can go first if you would like.
Sure. All right. So the first question I would have is, what is your process for assigning probabilities on events rather than just your opinion?
Well, you would, as in with the sciences, if you have a particular hypothesis, and then you say, well, notice that all the probabilities I've assigned here are conditional probabilities, which say, given some particular hypothesis, some event or some observation is either very likely, only slightly likely, or there's obviously a range of different likelihoods that you could assign, and so the number that you will, or the rough number that you'll give is going to be sensitive to the hypothesis that you're playing on. And so on theism, I think there are some things that we should expect to see, and some things that we should be rather surprised to see. And insofar as those can be maintained, they might constitute evidence.
But I'm just not seeing how this argument can encompass every single detail that is set through time from one instance of a local problem of suffering, and how that expands out to all the people that it touches. So I guess I don't see how the probabilistic version can take into account all of these things that take place and weigh objectively whether or not the good truly does outweigh the bad.
Sure. Okay, so presumably when you're speaking of this, you're talking about Rowe's argument, which was more in line with my first argument that I presented, where I argued that there are many instances of seemingly pointless instances of suffering. So what you're saying is that we don't have any good reason to think that we can know all the causal relations going on here, and that for all we know, there might be something 500 years in the future that happens which required some suffering now. And because we don't see that event in the future, that it looks as though it is pointless, right? That's essentially the argument being made here.
I'm saying it would at least get you to a push. And on the first argument, the apparently pointless suffering, you said God may have reasons for suffering, but God would never allow pointless suffering. And I get the claims, but I just don't see how we can objectively weigh that in a meaningful way that results in anything other than what Api said, which is we can just reasonably disagree with one another because we don't have all the evidence to say one way or another. So that's why I call this argument a push.
I'm curious what you mean by push. I'm not entirely clear on that.
There's not enough evidence to say either way which one is right, whether or not God does allow pointless suffering just on this argument, or whether he does not.
Sure, but notice that my argument was in the form of likelihoods, right? So what I'm saying is that the observations that we see about the suffering in the world, that those are not at all surprising on an indifferent hypothesis. But I'm saying there is some question as to whether or not they are surprising or expected on the theistic hypothesis. So what I'm saying here is that on theism, if theism is true and we observe these things, then what has to be the case is that there has to be some kind of observation which justifies this. And what I'm saying is that our not knowing that fact is a problem. Now, if what you're saying here is that you're endorsing skeptical theism, that's another problem that we can talk about. But I guess I'm not entirely sure what exactly your objection is.
Well, the objection is that when you're saying that God may have reasons for suffering, that in our local time, in the 80 years we're here, we need to have an answer as to why this event took place, why there's a greater good that outweighs this event of suffering. One, I don't see why you would arbitrarily place that parameter on the event to say we need to have an answer in time right now. And two, I'm wondering how you account for futuristic events which do seem possible to answer why this event did happen, even if we can't specifically point to the fact that that is it, that is exactly the one. You see what I mean?
Sure. So in response to the kind of causal butterfly effect, or ripple effect as you called it, about some future event, this I think undermines classical theism. I think that this response would only work on a significantly weaker God. So, for example, I mean, God is supposed to be all-powerful. He's not supposed to be limited by causal laws. Rather, he is their very author. And so I guess I was under the impression that God is able to actualize any coherent state of affairs, causal laws be damned. So again, if an instance of suffering is to be justified, we need to be identifying something such that that suffering was logically necessary for it. And if God is the author of causal laws, then future and past are irrelevant. He can make states of affairs occur. He can make that good in the future happen, regardless of whether the suffering in the present occurs.
Right, but if we have the presupposition that God would give us free will, then over that free will into a deterministic process or something like that would make natural laws not behave like natural laws. So things need to unfold in time as God would see fit based on how he has ordered the world on our free will. And he's not constrained by time to say, I have to give you an answer in 80 years. I very well can give it in 500, and he's not obligated to do either one. And yes, God can do everything if we understand omnipotence, but it has to be logically coherent. You know, it's like the rock too big to lift. Like, that's nonsensical. It's, it has to be logical.
Sure. So for whatever hypothetical example, you could talk about whatever great good you could talk about 500 years in the future. If you were to, just pull one out of your hat and essentially say, what if this happened and our current suffering was necessary for it? Then it would be easy for me to say, well, there's a logically coherent state of affairs that I could describe that as, and it does not require the current suffering. And to say that it would, I don't know how that could be justified, I guess, is what I'm saying. And I'm not entirely sure on your comments about free will. Could you bring those up again?
Yeah, let me answer what you just said, and then I'll get to the free will aspect. So if you can say, if you're saying that you can understand or you can create a new set of affairs that would make this potential instance of suffering not take place, if I'm understanding you correctly, is that right? That you can understand a set of affairs that would make it so the suffering never took place from the beginning. Is that what you're saying?
All I'm saying is that whatever thing you could possibly identify in the future that is a good thing, I'm saying that our suffering currently is not at all logically necessary for that to come about, because God is capable of miracles and he could just make it occur.
Right. Okay. So this is where the free will dynamic would come into play. So if I don't think God overrides our free will, do I think He can? I mean, I guess that's for another time. And Reformed folks may disagree with me on that, which is fine. But if God wants a world, if His main desire is a world with free creatures that lovingly enter into a relationship with Him freely, and overriding that to a point to say, well, now it's no longer free, I'm going to force you into a relationship, I'm going to force these things to happen, rather than just order them based on our free will decisions, which is the Molinism aspect.
Sure. Okay. Well, I guess my problem there would be that there's absolutely no reason to think that miracles, in the way that I've described them, are impinging upon free will. I mean, you believe in the resurrection. You don't believe that this was an affront to people's free will simply because God made a state of affairs of a person that was dead into a state of affairs where a person that was now alive again. There's no reason to think that that's a problem for free will. And in the same way, I'm suggesting that whatever good you want to identify in the future, it's quite plausible that it'd be very easy for God to just make it occur and not need the causal antecedents to bring it about.
Right, unless that be misunderstood. I'm not saying that miracles don't happen based on free will. Of course, the resurrection is a miraculous event. What I was saying is that if we're to take free will as being something that is serious and something that is taking place every day in our day-to-day lives, then it would be in our best interest not to say, well, God can just zap everything so that way suffering is gone and we don't really have any moral responsibilities for the things that we do. So yes, miracles and free will do and can coexist, I think, but I guess I'm having a hard time seeing why you're saying that futuristic proposition could be brought about by no suffering taking place.
Well, okay, so maybe we could talk about a concrete example. Could you give me an example? I mean, I think that would clarify what we're kind of talking abstractly here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's talk about, well, first of all, let's talk about just the kind of Rowe's example. So Rowe, in his 1979 paper, talks about a fawn who gets trapped in a forest fire that was caused by natural causes, by lightning hitting a tree, right?
Right.
And the fawn gets trapped, and it suffers horribly and dies after several days, right? So that's an instance of pretty extreme suffering. So there doesn't seem to be any free will to blame here, right? There was no moral agent interacting to bring about that state of affairs. And there doesn't seem to be anything learned morally from this. So the question is, maybe you could identify some causal scenario wherein several hundred years in the future that the carbon accumulated from the forest fire has some causal effects later, Like, that's what I'm saying, is that whatever state of affairs you can refer to that where that suffering is somehow justified, it fails as a justification, because whatever the state of affairs that is, you could easily bring that about if you're omnipotent, without impinging upon free will, without impinging upon free choice.
Well, why do you think it could be brought about without infringing upon a person's free will?
Well, I guess first identify, tell me some event in the future that could possibly be coherently justified by the forest fire and the fawn suffering.
Well, again, I just wanted to know the free will part, and I'll be glad to answer that question. I'm just kind of curious, that way I can understand where you're coming from about why a future event could be brought about without changing a person's free will or something that someone would do.
Well, future events, you can rearrange molecules. If you're God, you can rearrange molecules. You can create any state of affairs. So, for example, if the great good being acquired here is something like, I don't know, some father and daughter are reunited or something after some tragic story, right? You could always have natural causal things that come into play and guide people together, even though they're reacting in their circumstances in a free way, right? Just as you said, if you accept Molinism, you should have no problem with saying that God would know in certain circumstances what a person would freely choose to do. And I'm saying that God could set up the circumstances such that they freely follow the path that God wants them to take and bring about this great good. And it doesn't need to be justified by suffering happening 100 years earlier. So what I'm saying is that this theodicy is just remarkably implausible.
I don't think that's the case, and I think one thing you're failing to take into account is that God ordering the world based on our free will decisions is based on our free will decisions. It's not like he can bring about a set of circumstances that someone would not have done. I mean, that's incoherent. Excuse me. So I guess that's what I'm failing to see. And getting back to the fawn in the forest, I mean, I can't tell you an event right now that would justify the fawn dying in the tree. I don't really have a tremendous example, but the point is that it is possible that could take place, that there could be an event as such. It's not logically impossible. So if that's the case, and we don't know what the future events are holding, why are we placing so much value on this argument that we can't be sure of? And I'm not saying that this is an argument that fails miserably or goes down in flames. I do agree with Oppie when he says that reasonable people can disagree on this because there's so much evidence that we don't know about a particular event in time. So that's why I call it a push at best, and that we need to examine other arguments rather than one like this. So that's all I was getting at.
Okay, sure. And I totally agree with you that it's possible. Right, there's a logically possible scenario where these things could be justified by things I can't even conceive of. That's perfectly fine. But to think that this does anything to the strength of the evidential argument would just be to misunderstand the evidential argument. But I would like to get back to this concept of free will and how this could plausibly serve as a theodicy in response to certain instances of suffering. What I guess I'm curious about is what's so valuable about free will? What gives free will its goodness? Why is free will a valuable thing?
Well, the ability to choose A or not A and have your let's say you pick up a deterministic point of view, then there's literally no meaning in anything that you do because it's already predetermined. So okay. I think on its face, if you compare free will to determinism, I mean, it seems properly basic that one is far superior to the other. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, I'll step aside for that question for now, but I guess what I'm asking now is that if it's the case that God does not have the kind of robust free will that you're talking about, then does that suggest that God lacks a particular good-making property? And if so, how on earth can you say that free will is a good thing, because then that's a moral value that you don't have grounded in God. And I'm wondering where you're getting this idea that free will is good on theism.
All right, so go back to what you said about God not having free will. Repeat that one more time.
Well, at least in terms of the kind of free will that you're referring to, which is a kind of libertarian free will, which I'm not entirely sure is I mean, I'll step aside that question, but if we're talking about libertarian free will, which is a genuine choice between, right or wrong action, right? So it entails some kind of moral free will. God has no such thing as moral free will. It is impossible. It is a logical contradiction to say that God, if we're defining God as classical theism here, that God is capable of performing a wrong action, correct?
If you're saying God is incapable of sinning, I would say yes, if that's what you mean by wrong action.
Yeah. So God does not have moral free will, is what I'm saying.
But as a maximally great being, what I'm saying is that God's nature is goodness, and that doesn't play into sin. So can God do whatever he'd like to do? Well, as long as it's logically coherent with his nature, then yes. So in getting back to God's free will and our free will, what I'm saying here is that God makes the decision as to what type of world he wants to have. And if he wants a world of free creatures, from that decree, all of those things going forward are based off of his decision to say, I want a world with free creatures. And of course, he could say, I want a world that's based off of determinism, where I control people to do what I want them to do. And that's his will. That's whatever he'd like to do. But I think biblically and philosophically, we can make arguments for free will from the nature of God that give us these various set of circumstances where people do commit evil acts, and suffering does happen in the world. So I don't think you can have a world where everyone has libertarian free will and it's free of evil and suffering. And I think if that was logically possible, that's the world we would be in right now. But we're not in that world, so I don't think it's logically possible.
Okay, but you do think that so you believe in God, so you believe in a being that does not have moral free will, but nevertheless, because of his nature, his morally perfect nature, always does the morally perfect thing, correct?
See, you're misdefining free will based on the nature of God.
Well,
so
I'm not even talking about free will here. I just said what you believe. You believe that God always does the free will thing necessarily because he's a morally perfect being, right?
Yeah,
right, and you don't think there's anything trivial about that, right? You think it's perfectly significant and it's a great good that he always does the perfect thing, right?
I guess I'm not understanding your line of questioning. So you're saying that my belief is that let me just give you my belief about the moral values and duties of God.
Sure.
So what I'm saying is that God has a maximally great nature of morality, so of goodness, or however you want to word it. And from that stems our values and duties as human beings. So yes, God is morally perfect in that way where he doesn't sin, but his free will is juxtaposed to his nature. So he can't do anything out of his nature because that would be logically contradictory. So saying, can God sin, that's like saying, can you be a married bachelor? Like, no, he can't sin. It's logically contradictory. So that's my position. Does that clear things up?
Yeah, and I guess, whether or not we call that free will, we can set that aside. I'm fine with just calling free will essentially libertarian free will, right? So yeah. God wouldn't have libertarian free will. You would agree?
No, he would. Because it's based on his nature. Whatever he wants to do, he can. But you got to look at things logically.
Sure.
Can. All right.
Okay. So yeah, let's move on forward with that premise. So God has libertarian free will, which means that I don't know. Maybe we're just defining this differently, but I take it as an axiom of classical theism that as a matter of principle, it is impossible or logically impossible for God to do something that is wrong, right? I would assume that that's something you would agree to.
Right.
Okay, so under at least the typical view of libertarian free will, there's a real possibility that a person will do wrong. So under that definition, I don't think God would have free will, and that's my point here. Doesn't have libertarian free will.
I disagree with the definitions, but I see what you're saying, and I would again just point back to the nature of God based on free will. Like our natures,
that's perfectly fine.
We have a restricted nature, but we still have libertarian free will.
Yeah. Okay. So the question is, when we go back in time and or prior to time, and we're thinking about God when he has his choice of world to actualize, and the choice of the kinds of persons to actualize. Is there any moral justification whatsoever for him to create persons that are anything less than also having morally perfect natures? Because if they had morally perfect natures, then would they not necessarily, as God does, do the correct thing all the time? And would that be any less trivial than God's own decisions?
So it sounds like what you're saying is if God were to create people, they would essentially be mini gods, where they would have the same exact identical nature as he does. Is that what you're getting at?
I'm saying if it's a good thing that God has a morally perfect nature, such that every action he does leads to the perfect act, and he always makes the right choices. If that's a good thing, and it's not trivial, and it's a good thing, then what justification does God have to creating a population of people who have anything less than that?
I guess, again, I'm missing the distinction being made here, because if God wants to make people with free will, he's not making people with morally perfect natures like himself. He's not making many gods, and I would argue that would be logically contradictory.
But again, okay, so we're talking about free will, but I think we're using it differently. All I'm saying is that if God, as something flowing from his nature, always does the correct thing, and you think that that's a good thing, right? Then the question is, why did he not also make it the case that human persons are morally perfect creatures who are free in your sense, but because of their nature, always do the good thing? So there's nothing, if it's a problem for those humans that they're morally perfect and that they always do the good thing, then the same problem applies to God. I'm asking why it is that God chose to create persons that have a lesser moral quality than God did in the first place. And
Because
is there any justification for that?
Well, I would say he's not creating creatures who are deterministic in that way of...
That's not deterministic, though. Not any more than God, right?
Right. Well, if you can
so
let me
what's the problem?
If you can let me finish, I'll get to that.
Okay.
So, saying if he's creating people who are, in what you're saying, have a morally perfect nature, so they have a morally perfect nature endowed with libertarian free will, I would count that as a divine attribute, not a human attribute. So I think it's a category error. So I think when he creates people to have a legitimate decision, interact with one another, who would be unlike God, that they do have that choice to do good and bad. And I would argue that people were originally created with a good nature, and then they fell in the fall by sinning. So again, I think it's a category error, because you're saying, why didn't God create more people just like himself? Why didn't God create other gods? And I don't know, it just doesn't seem like a meaningful question to me. Maybe I'm just misunderstanding.
Okay, well, I mean, there's a couple things you said there that I'm a little bit confused about. For on the one hand, you said that it's a category error in that it's impossible for humans to have a divine attribute, correct? Okay. Well, then we have a problem with Jesus. Secondly, you also said that, despite having just said that it's impossible, you also said that in the beginning we did have morally perfect natures. The problem there, of course, is that no, we didn't, because if we did, then as God, we would necessarily do the good and we would never fail. Right.
Right. All right. So let me pick up with the Jesus thing first, and then I'll address the in the beginning we had morally perfect natures. That was a misspeak on my part. But why do we have a problem with Jesus? If we understand the classical doctrine of atheistic union, where
this okay, so right. So if we have some doctrine of some as what was the hypostatic union? I forget how to say that, but so if it's coherent to speak about persons having attributes such as moral perfection, as you believe Jesus did, right? You believe as a result of Jesus' perfect moral nature that it was impossible for Jesus to sin, correct?
All right. It was impossible for Jesus and his humanity to sin. No, I think it was logically possible for Jesus and his humanity to sin, but he did not. So that's why I said that's when we're talking about this doctrine, which is quite deep. So we would say that Jesus, as the second person of the Trinity, has always existed, the eternal Sonship, and that when God came down, and we would talk about the incarnation, added human nature to the second person.
Yeah.
That is far different than God creating one single person who doesn't have a separate attribute of deity, because Jesus in his deity wasn't ever created, and he was always there.
Sure. So you've given me your theology, but you haven't given me a reason to suggest that it's logically impossible that persons be created with morally perfect natures. You've said that this is a category error, but all that means is that this is you're just grouping things differently. I'm suggesting there's nothing at all logically impossible about God creating persons that all have morally perfect natures and as a result never do anything wrong. And that, to me, if it's trivial, then so too is God in his own decisions, because they would be motivated in the exact same axiomatic way.
I don't see the two-ness, if you will, of saying that if God wants to create a creature who has a morally perfect being, then they can't therefore sin. So they can't do things that are wrong, but they still have libertarian free will. And that's a difference between a divine and a human attribute. Again, and that's why I said I misspoke when I said morally perfect. I meant morally good before the fall.
Okay.
Hey, Rob, sorry, I want to just cut in because I think that Justin has had far more of an opportunity to grill Rob than Rob has.
Oh,
I just want to try to make it a little bit fair, because we're actually almost to the end of this. to the end of the time we allotted, kind of unofficially. So, Rob, I want to give you the opportunity to ask Justin any questions you might have.
Okay. All right. So the first question that I would have is on naturalism: is suffering objectively bad?
Well, first of all, I've not defended naturalism this evening, but is it objectively bad? That'll depend on exactly what you mean by those words, and it'll depend on the naturalist you subscribe to, because naturalism, obviously, as you probably know, is defined in many different ways.
Right.
At least as I define it, not necessarily.
Okay, so we'll leave aside the naturalistic part for a moment. So, is suffering objectively bad? And let me define what I mean. By objective, I mean valid and binding outside of our thoughts and emotions, or our feelings.
Are you asking if I personally think that this is true?
Right.
Okay. I think yes. But
why it hinges on your argument.
Here's the thing. Well, I'll say two things. I'll say, first, yes. Secondly, I think it's irrelevant to my argument because my arguments are about our explanatory comparisons, and quite obviously on theism, it must be true that those are mind-independent properties, right? So if that's the case, then that's why it's kind of irrelevant, because the explanatory power is there in the first place.
Right, so I agree. So if you were to come at it from a Christian world perspective and critique mainly the Christian view and say, we do have these things that are objective in this context, but the line of questioning is simply to say, what makes you assume that to be the case outside of Christianity? Does that make sense?
Sorry, what am I assuming outside of Christianity again?
Where is that grounding for suffering coming from? To that question.
Sure, but notice that nowhere in any of my arguments is the premise that suffering is bad on indifference or on naturalism. I've never stated that, and my arguments do not require it.
All right, we'll move on. So let me go back to this to the second argument here. You said sentient beings are supposed to flourish, and that God can make people flourish. So, if God, and that was your one of your premises, is that God can make people flourish. So, in what way is that coherent with what we say about free will? So, I just wanted you to define that a little bit better.
Are you asking specifically about the three reasons I gave for why on theism sentient beings are at least supposed to flourish? Is that what you're asking me?
Yeah, I had a note, and maybe I wrote it down incorrectly, but you said God can make people flourish, and I wanted you to expand on that a little bit more.
Oh, I just mean that God is in a position and has the requisite abilities in order to make it the case that, for example, resources aren't so scarce. On naturalism or on indifference, there's a finite number, and as we all know, that the scarcity is increasing, and it's a problem. But on theism, there would, of course, be no affront to free will to say that God could, magically multiply loaves and fishes, right?
Okay. All right. So, okay, that helps me a little bit more. So I wanted to pull back to skeptical theism because you said you wanted to go more into that
Sure.
for one of the reasons I pointed out. So let's say we import Van and Wagen and what he has to say about skeptical theism, and that we should not be able to discern why an all-loving, knowing, and powerful God would permit suffering.
Yeah. Well, if you adopt skeptical theism, then that would do away with my first argument. I'll fully admit to that. And maybe that's where you were reading that Graham Oppie quote. Maybe that was what that context was. But yeah, if you adopt skeptical theism, Rowe's argument falls away. But it does not touch my second argument, which is a comparative likelihood argument, which essentially the way I would respond to that argument if skeptical theism were put forward as a rebuttal would be to say, okay, well, it's certainly possible that there are reasons that we don't know of that might justify God's permitting the suffering. But again, if we can appeal to unknowns, it's also possible that there are extra reasons why God would want to prevent that suffering. And without antecedent reasons for preferring one of those collections of reasons be either greater in number or intensity than the other, then they cancel each other out. And at the end of the day, indifference is a better explanation than theism.
All right, but if it's merely indifferent, if what you're saying is that the skeptical theism can't, and you were talking about flourishing, right? Your second argument?
Correct.
Okay. So if skeptical theism can't touch flourishing, it sounds like to me you're saying, well, we don't know one way, and if we're not sure the other way, then what we're left with is indifference. And I would argue that we just don't know in general why those particular claims about flourishing would have any relevance to the topic here as far as suffering. So I guess I just don't see why the flourishing thing, I guess, even matters. This is what I was trying to have you clarify, because maybe I missed it in the original piece.
Yeah. So if you recall, the second argument, what I was doing is I was identifying 3 facts about the tendency for with which creatures either flourish or languish, right? And what I'm saying is that those 3 facts are very likely on indifference, right? So you would agree with that those observations are not at all surprising on indifference. But now we get to well, that was the second premise. So the first premise would be that they are unlikely on theism. So if you want to say that, well, theism doesn't predict that, then all you're doing is you're undermining further the explanatory power to explain those observations. And so regardless, at the end of the day, indifference is a better explanation than those facts, because indifference says something about whether or not we'd be able to predict them or not predict them. And theism, if you adopt skeptical theism, suggests we can't even know. So it's barely an explanatory hypothesis in the first place. So the evidence should be forthcoming.
Okay. All right, that was it for my questions.
Okay, good. We went a little over time on that, but I wanted to make sure that Rob had a chance to grill Justin a little bit. So thanks, guys. That was excellent. Well, we have a large stream of questions. Can I ask you guys real quick, can you see the questions, or is that just me right now?
I might be able to if I go online.
Don't worry about it. I just wanted to check because I think I can highlight them here, and it should work. Okay. So, as I had referenced, we do have an imbalance. A lot of questions for Rob. So, Rob, you may be in for something here, but I'm going to do my best.
Yeah, try and split them if you can.
Well, I will try, but unfortunately, we are not getting very many for Justin. But I have one myself that I really want to ask Justin, but I think I'm going to start with some we've had here waiting for a while. Thanks everyone for the questions you've asked. So I have maybe a quick one for Rob here. Let me see if this works when I select it. Can you guys see that?
I can't, unfortunately.
Okay, if it didn't pop up, I will go ahead and read it. And this is from Charlie Baker. God interfering with our free will, and he's quoting Exodus, when the Lord hardens Pharaoh's heart, and he would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said to Moses. So what would your response to that be, Rob, where it looks like in the Bible, and I know, again, we were more talking about theism and not Christianity, but given that you subscribe, and you mentioned the Bible and that you subscribe to Christianity, what would you say to that quote, if you don't mind?
Yeah, that's a fair question. And what's important is that particular issue in Exodus 9 backs up a little bit further, as we see God giving Pharaoh time and time again chances to turn the people over. And, after each plague, was another question posed and so on. And this is actually brought up in Romans 9 as well. This is God hardened Pharaoh's heart. But I think, again, and I do adopt this idea of Molinism, that based on all of the things that God knew Pharaoh would do, that he hardened his heart based on what Pharaoh had done. So I think it's both based on how God had ordered the world, but it's also based on what Pharaoh did and would have continued to do.
I think you probably described it by context a little bit, but I was really trying hard not to interrupt your guys' flow because it was really good. But I did want to wonder for people, definitely not me, but for other people, if you could define Molinism. I mean, I know I could do it, but no, could you define for maybe the people who aren't as experienced in philosophy of religion as you two clearly are, define Molinism, and also if someone could give a good quick definition of skeptical theism, just in case, to clarify for people trying to follow along.
Yeah, I'll pick up on Molinism, and then I'll let Justin do skeptical theism. So Molinism was this idea that was developed by Louis Molina, as a 16th century Jesuit priest, and what happened, he's a counter-reformer, right? So he was trying to understand these two streams that we see in the Bible of free will and God's sovereignty. So he posited that there is a third type of knowledge that God has, and it's called middle because it falls logically between God's free knowledge and natural knowledge, and it's before the divine decree, which states that God knows what we would do, not could or will, but knows what we would do in any set of circumstances. And based on that, he can order the world, maintaining our free will and still getting his will done. So that's a snapshot of it, and there's actually an article on the website that I just wrote called A Brief Sketch of Molinism, so if anyone wants to familiarize themselves with
That's
that.
apologetics105.com, right?
That's right, yep.
Perfect. Okay, well, skeptical theism was developed primarily as a response to Rowe's argument, Rowe's evidential argument from evil. And skeptical theism, well, I should say that the argument is within the argument there is an attempt to move from the claim that there are many instances of suffering which appear to be gratuitous, which appear to be pointless, to the claim that therefore at least one of them is pointless, right? So that seems like a really intuitive kind of move, but the skeptical theist comes along and says, look, compared to God, our knowledge and our understanding of the causal relations of different events is so minimal that we are not even entitled to that kind of inference. And so the skeptical theist pulls the rug out from under the Rowe-style argument and says, look, we can't even say that. The problem is that, at least within the last 10 years or so, there's been a swath of papers about skeptical theism highlighting some of the things that it also entails, which are not particularly welcome on the theistic view.
So do you accept that as a good definition, Rob?
Yeah, I think that's fine. I think that's pretty basic.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to ask you, is that something you subscribe to? Because I'm actually getting, in the questions, I'm getting some people who think you do and some people who don't. And I know multiple times Justin said, well, if you subscribe to skeptical theism, then, most of this goes away, or maybe the particular point he was talking about. Is that something you subscribe to? And if not, why don't you?
No, I don't subscribe to it as saying this is the ground I'm sticking my flag into, and the reason why is because I'm not familiar with it enough to articulate it to a point where I can defend it adamantly. If we're just talking about skeptical theism with, say, another Christian or something, the reason why I used it in my opening is because I think it's a good potential option, and I don't see anything contradictory about it on its face. But no, it's not something that I would define myself as in a proper sense.
So Justin, if he had, let's say, said, well, I'm a skeptical theist, therefore, et cetera, how would you have defended your claims today against that?
Well, at least if we're talking about Rowe's argument, Rowe's original formulation of the argument, skeptical theism, I would argue, does do away with Rowe's argument. But it doesn't come out of that unscathed. There are problems that skeptical theism, at least the kind which would be able to dispense with Rowe's argument, there are problems with that kind of skeptical theism. One of them being that it would seem to put people in a kind of moral paralysis. So if we are unable to place probabilities on the motivations of God in the relation to the states of affairs in the world, then, for example, if I'm walking around in a park and there's a little girl drowning in a pond, I could easily save her. But then I have to ask the question, well, who am I to say that this is not for some greater good? Who am I to intervene on God's ultimate plan? Maybe this death is necessary for some suffering 500 years in the future. So this kind of extreme skepticism is not without its problems.
So I'm going to get to more questions submitted, definitely, but just, again, because of that imbalance, I'd like to ask Justin a question, and it has to do with something Rob said. Now, Rob, as one of his arguments, and Rob, if I get this wrong, let me know. He had mentioned that atheists will say, well, why couldn't God's all powerful? Why couldn't he have come up with a better system, a better way of creating us that isn't so full of suffering, et cetera, et cetera? And I believe Rob's main response was, well, can you propose one? I mean, he's never heard of an atheist who can give an alternate explanation, an alternate kind of schematic of how a process that would have led to us could come about. Do you see that as a valid challenge? I mean, I know if we were talking scientifically, I think we would be required to provide some sort of plausible alternative when you're talking about models of the universe or anything like that. It's not like you can just say, well, something, like you usually have to define something. So do you see that as a valid criticism?
Well, if I'm remembering correctly, it was in the context of a discussion about the possible justifying reasons for free will, right? And I was saying that he was saying that, look, if you want to say that it's possible to have free will and to guarantee that there will be no evil or no sin or whatever, then that's a problem. And so presumably he's kind of referring to this idea of Alvin Plantinga put together this free will defense, which is a response to the logical problem of evil, which attempts to say that there is a logical contradiction. It's a much stronger claim than I was making tonight. And Plantinga was saying, look, here's a scenario where it's possible to have, or here's a scenario that shows that it's impossible for God to preserve libertarian free will and while at the same time also completely preventing any evil, right? So I believe his comment was in response to something like that. What I was suggesting is free will be damned. If God doesn't have the kind of libertarian free will in the sense of morally significant free will where he can legitimately choose between two options, because it's impossible for God to choose evil. If that's a perfectly fine scenario, why can't God just multiply that? Why can't he give us all perfect natures and have us be, acting perfectly as a result? That's, of course, not an impingement on free will. It's just showing that free will is irrelevant. Because if God's lacking free will is not a bad thing, then why is it bad for us to lack it?
Rob, I'd like to give you a chance to respond to that if you want.
Sure, and that's because God doesn't create maximally great beings. He creates human beings. So I would argue that that's just like saying we need to create more gods. And I get what you're saying as far as why, if God has this morally perfect nature, but we still say that he has free will to choose, why is that the case? And why can't he duplicate that into humanity? My response still is because he's not creating more gods. He's not creating people with like natures, with those maximally great attributes.
But why isn't he? That was one area of the exchange that I'm not sure I got. I'm not sure I understood your argument, Rob, because Justin was asking essentially why create these kind of pathetic humans? why create us when he could just create other beings like him that apparently have fulfillment and whatever extent you guys agreed if God has free will, and definitely God is good. I think you can both agree that by definition, I mean, God is a good being. So why can't he just create more little gods instead of us?
Well, if he created more little gods, that would mean that he is no longer the maximally great being. That would be that'd be more like a Mormonistic type theology. So I guess I just don't see how that. I don't think that would be logically possible to do that, because then he would no longer be maximally great. And I'll be honest, I've actually never had that question posed to me before, so I would definitely like to look at it more. But that would be my initial reaction. So I think it's a good question. I think it's a question that deserves probably a better answer than what I gave. But I think that would be my first thing, is that maximally great being category would no longer be solely owned, and it sounds a lot like a Mormonistic type theology to me.
Do you care to respond to that, Justin? Or
I would like to, but I don't know that it's appropriate. Maybe we should go to more questions.
Okay, we'll go to more questions. Let me ask one. I think this has come up a lot of different listeners. So let me go ahead and select that, even though I know it's not doing YouTube much good. I think you can't see it, but maybe the viewers can see it. Jeff Louder is watching, so thanks, Jeff. Very appreciated.
Hey, Jeff.
Much appreciated. And he submitted a lot of incredibly thoughtful questions. But he says, human freedom at best explains so-called moral evils. It doesn't explain so-called natural evils like floods, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, etc. So, Rob, what would your response to that be?
That natural laws have to work in natural ways for us to understand them in a meaningful sense. If laws were sort of a hodgepodge put together of things work sometimes, things don't work other times, then it would be extremely difficult for us to understand the reality of natural disasters, like you mentioned. The other thing, too, is that human beings are not without fault for what we see in the natural world. Like, for instance, we have a significant intelligence about how things take place, weather patterns, and the like. And even take a terrible, terrible tragedy like Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Like, we knew that the walls they built were only Category 3. We knew Category 5 storms exist, yet people still lived there, and they knew it was a frequented zone. So I think a combination of natural laws having to work in natural ways, as well as a certain level of responsibility for humanity, would go a long way to answering that.
But surely that only explains for the last, 100 years? Or, I mean, how long have we had the requisite knowledge to make that our fault? And as far as I know, I mean, the science of the earth hasn't changed a whole lot. It may have been worse at some times, may have been a little better, but natural disasters have to have been occurring long before we knew how to do anything about it, don't you think?
Oh, definitely, and that's why I said that the second part's more of a peripheral additive than what natural law is having to work consistently. I think that's the primary answer.
And so I guess that entails, and I want to make sure I get this right, that whatever laws are required for free will, those, you're saying those entail other evils, like, or I don't know if that evils is the right word, but other suffering like earthquakes and floods. Like, in order for them to be consistent, those things need to happen. Is that right?
Yeah, I think if we and let's look at the Christian worldview for a moment and look at something like the fall of humanity. So these things taking place after the fall, and we could probably talk about different Christians who definitely disagree on that, about how the fall exactly works. But yeah, I think if we're consistent and we say, for instance, we have typhoons or earthquakes or tornadoes or fires or whatever, that would, one, be a result of the fall, and two, also be restricted to something like the natural evils always having to work on a consistent basis. So that would entail part of my response, I guess.
Forgive me for grilling you one more time on this, because I just thought of something else, and I can't help it. I got to ask this.
You better grill me next, damn it.
I will. I do have a good one for you, Justin. Don't worry. But assume it's not unlikely. It seems to me not unreasonable to assume that one day, 100, 200 years, I don't know what, we will have the technology and ability to avoid virtually every natural disaster. Do you have any explanation for why God would then have wanted to sort of punish people in primitive times more so than in that time? I mean, in that time, most of these instances of suffering would be eliminated, and life would be just way better. I mean, what did the people born 1,000 years ago do so wrong to have that much more suffering inflicted on them?
Yeah, two things. I don't really mind you grilling me, because when Justin and I had our first debate, he received and this was in my town, so he received far more grilling than I did.
This is justified suffering.
So I think one big mistake a lot of Christians make is they say, like, floods and natural disasters are God's punishment on people, and I guess I just don't see that to be the case, at least biblically speaking. I think it's a case of natural law taking place, and we can talk about why that's the case or why God might have a reason, but we could always talk about the skeptical theistic part, or theism part, which says, we may not know why this particular natural disaster took place, but there's nothing logically incoherent by saying God doesn't have a reason for it. But people just saying it's just God's punishment, it's God, saying these people are terrible. I don't know. I've never agreed with that. I think that's
I want to clarify. I'm not saying it's his punishment, but I am saying that would it not be considered unjust of a perfect being to inflict so much more suffering that, I mean, by your view is necessary in some way, on a people who lived 1,000 years ago versus a people who lived later, who, I mean, just any given person born at that time, did they do anything more wrong? I mean, does that not strike you as unjust? I'm not saying he's punishing per se, but the distribution of this natural suffering, as it were, isn't that a bit unjust?
Well, I guess you mentioned in the beginning that in a couple hundred years we may have a way to route pretty much every single natural disaster, and I would love to hear why that's the case. I think that'd be awesome. I don't think it's true, but no, I don't.
Do you think that's impossible? I mean, just look at the casualties that happen in this country, for example, when there's a flood, a hurricane. They're still bad, of course, but they're so much better than in countries that are a little bit, in areas that are a little bit more behind in technology and development. Is it unreasonable to assume that that might carry forward to the point where it'd be greatly reduced? Maybe it won't be eliminated, but there could be a time when most of the planet doesn't really even suffer from natural disasters.
I think it could be better, and that sort of ties into the second part of what I was saying, which is why I think we as humans should have more responsibility to do things like fix living conditions in third world countries for people. So that may very well be a part of it, saying these things are continually happening. We need to build up other countries who are not our own, who are not in a third world status. So yeah, I don't see it as punishment, and I don't see that it's, you said, unjust to the people who were 1,000 years prior. And the other thing, too, is if we do understand God to be the author of life, then we don't really have any guarantee to live X amount of years anyhow. So I think it's a fun topic. I think it's interesting. I would definitely like to talk more, not now, but about the conditions in a couple hundred years that would limit natural disasters. I think that'd be interesting.
Well, I have a bigger question for you, Justin, but I want to point that last part towards you. I don't think that came up necessarily in your guys' exchange. What do you think about what he just said, what Rob just said, that we don't necessarily have, what was the words, that we don't really have like the right to a certain, I'm sorry, Rob, can you repeat what you said on that?
It is, if we were...
not the authors of life, that part.
Right. Yeah. So if we understand God to be the author of life, we don't necessarily have any right to say this is when we need to, this is where we need to live. We're not guaranteed 80 years. So and again, Christian worldview, we understand that there's something far better than this life after our human bodies pass. So
what would be your response to that, Justin?
To the God's the author of life, and therefore...
Yeah, I mean, as a I guess a response to your arguments about
Sure.
suffering, if you were to say, well, God's the author of life, and he has the right to sort of...
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably... I mean, obviously, the author of life premise there is going to be entailed by both theism and specific forms of theism like Christianity, and it might be that Christianity also entails the additional claim that therefore, he has the right to take, essentially the Bill Cosby theodicy where, I brought you in this world, I can take you out. It might be that Christianity... We
need to find a new name for that now.
I know. But what I would say about that is I don't think that you could reach that conclusion from that premise, and I would say that the conclusion that therefore that God can take your life away without any care, I don't think that that's entailed by the claim that he's the author of life. And so I think that it would be false on theism, but maybe that's something entailed specially to Christian theism. But Christian theism is not something I take terribly seriously at this point. So I don't think that would apply to theism generally, but maybe it's a specific feature of Christian theism.
Okay, well, I've referenced it. I'm gonna go ahead and start on what I think is my best question for you, Justin. I hope we'll see. One of the more interesting exchanges I think you guys had was when you were talking about. I believe Rob asked Justin about why suffering would be necessarily bad under naturalism, and Justin, your response was interesting. I thought that was a good question, but your response, you sidestepped it, but I think legitimately by saying you're not defending naturalism. The proposition up for debate is more, is suffering evidence against God, assuming theism? Assuming, right? Is that a proper characterization, roughly, of what you said?
Right. So essentially, my point was there that on naturalism, it may or may not be that moral realism of some sort is true, right? Naturalism doesn't guarantee that. But on theism, I would take it as relatively uncontroversial that theism does entail that a robust kind of moral realism is true. So when you compare those two hypotheses, one entailing the moral issue and one not, then, at least looking at it that way, then these problems with morally bad states of affairs like suffering, that theism is going to have a weaker explanatory power there. But his question was about whether or not on these things are really bad on naturalism. But again, the argument doesn't require that they be bad.
Right, that's the part I wanted to highlight, and I thought it was interesting, and then I thought it's almost as though you were handing over the reins to theism as to whether or not suffering is bad, because I do think it is pretty vital, one way or the other, to your argument, Justin, to say that suffering is something bad. I mean, it's not...
Well, it's bad in the sense that, I'm going to use negative value terms to describe what happens when I stub my toe, quite clearly. But we're talking about suffering for a reason, right? I mean, the debate is suffering, but not... The debate is not, golf. Is it evidence against God? The debate is not, specifically... It's not something... Right, I mean, and I thought it was interesting that you were saying that all that matters is that it's bad under theism, which I think it's true, because you're saying you're almost saying it's inconsistent. You're pointing out an inconsistency logically, No, I don't want to do that. So maybe it's possible, of course, that I misspoke. So I don't want to say that suffering entails the falsity of theism.
Sure.
All I want to say is that you have this observation, this empirical fact of suffering, right? That's not up for debate. The empirical fact is that there's a widespread, there's a lot of suffering going on, right? And so the question is whether or not, what the implication of that is on theism and what the implication of that is on a plausible atheistic hypothesis. On theism, it's entailed, or at least I would think that it's plausibly entailed, that suffering is a bad thing, that there's an extra thing being added to the mere empirical fact that there's suffering going on. But it's that suffering is not only happening, but it's bad, and that has a special relevance to a theistic hypothesis, which says that God is, among other things, admittedly, interested also in the well-being of his conscious creatures. And
go ahead.
Yeah, and that's why I'm saying that's why it's especially a problem for theism, because of that interesting relationship. On indifference, there is nobody out to protect us, right? There is nobody interested in our well-being except for us. And so that's the incongruity going on there, I guess.
Right, I see what you're saying, but I'm glad I get a chance to grill you a bit, because and maybe apologies if I'm missing something, but I think the interesting point that I'm trying to illustrate here is that you did say that it's not entirely relevant on naturalism or on indifference to establish that suffering is necessarily bad. I think you did grant that. I hope you granted that it's necessary to your arguments to have a belief that suffering is bad. Otherwise, why are you even asking the question of...
Well, let me think about this. I'm not entirely sure. I mean, if I were just a complete nihilist and I thought that value terms were just if I was the most extreme nihilist ever and I thought that value terms were just meaningless, then I could still raise this argument, because it would still be the case that we're talking about the empirical fact of suffering, not the value of suffering. So the empirical fact of suffering...
Well, and you're talking about relative to theism, right? I mean, you're talking about...
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so the question I want to bring to you now is, could not one therefore say, well, if we're using sort of the value judgments of theism here, and we're using, to be consistent, we're going with that, could you not just say, under theism, sure, suffering is bad, but free will is better than that. And
Yeah,
you would be kind of forced. Well, yeah, but you're sort of forced to accept that if you're only going with theism's definition of what's right and wrong. I mean, isn't that sort of a way out of your arguments?
Well, yeah. So the free will, the appeal to free will, would be an attempt to say that, like, that this goes to some degree to explaining the suffering, right? Because remember, my argument was an explanatory argument, exploring the explanatory power of theism relative to indifference, right? So yeah, I mean, it's been done quite a few times before, where someone would appeal to free will to explain some kind of suffering. But as your questioner Jeff Lauder already brought to the table, that really only applies to moral suffering, and usually philosophers want to distinguish moral suffering from natural suffering. Moral suffering being the suffering that is in some way the fault of a moral agent, and natural suffering being suffering which is the fault of, or maybe not the fault of, is the result of the laws and the way that the universe is set up. So,
right.
So free will would be relevant to one half of that equation.
Do you want to respond to that, Rob?
Well, yeah, the reason why I asked the question, and I know Justin's not defending naturalism, but I thought it was important to bring out because I don't think, if he's saying we see suffering in the world, and then theism gives a poor explanation to why that's the case, I want to know, why do you think suffering is objectively bad? Like, where is it grounded in? To me, the most consistent position is nihilism, because you're saying ethics and morals are illusory. But if that's the case, then why argue that there's suffering in the world objectively, and that theism is a poor explanation for it? That's why I asked the question. I just think I don't think a naturalist or an atheist can ground objective moral values and duties, which do pertain very heavily to suffering.
Sure. So I guess there's two things to address there. There's one that naturalists or atheists would be incapable of grounding facts about the values of suffering, and that's an interesting question, and there's a variety of answers out there, obviously, and some of them being that it's not even necessary to ground them, that in the sense that you could just say that these are just facts that exist out there. They don't get further explained. They're just brute in the universe, right? That's like one possible way. There's other ways, of course. I'm not necessarily subscribing to that, but and then there's the question of whether or not one can run this argument, this comparative explanatory argument, by appealing to the empirical fact of suffering. The empirical fact of suffering is something we both agree on. That's the agreed upon observation here. The question is whether or not that observation fits better on naturalism or on indifference or on theism. On theism, there is something that does not exist on naturalism, mainly a God who cares about suffering, right? So that's a huge difference. On theism, you'd expect that it wouldn't just be a complete indifferent free-for-all about the suffering. On theism, you'd expect certain intervening behaviors, perhaps, from morally perfect beings. So it's less expected on theism. At the very least, it's less expected.
Yeah, I guess I just don't see, because you said we both observe suffering in the world, so we both observe things that take place that would institute suffering. But the question is, how do we ground it? How do we know that it's not illusory? And you can say
suffering isn't illusory.
But it may very well be if you're a nihilist, if it's not objective. Like, why is it bad? Okay. So you mentioned an abstract object, like it could be grounded in something else, but abstract objects don't have any causal powers. They can't tell you to do something, so it would be insufficient to grounding a duty. But you didn't say you held to that view, you said that's a possibility, but I think that view, just by the fact that abstract objects aren't causal, we can't account for duties, which are objective. So,
sure. I'll address both these points. As to the issue about abstract objects, I mean, nothing about the things that I did say about that view entails that they need to be causally relevant here. It is not those abstract objects which are doing the actions in the world. That's not what the view would say. Secondly, what was the point you made just before that about? I'm forgetting, but perhaps we can move on.
We can move on. We've talked about that quite a bit, and that was in our last debate as well. So.
Okay. Well, I have another question from me. I think it'll be hopefully the last one that no one asked, because I really want to know. I cannot think of a possible explanation. We talked a lot about hypothetical examples of suffering, and the fawn argument was brought up, or the fawn scenario, I guess. And that's when, a natural fire from like lightning burns down the forest or whatever, a fawn is caught in it and dies and suffers. I just want to put to you, Rob, you did seem to answer those things by saying the ripple effect, there could be unknown goods that come of that sort of thing. That was, roughly speaking, your answer to that problem, right? I just want to clarify before I go on.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, I really cannot think of the difference. Given an all-powerful God, how in the world could there be more good that would come from the fawn burning to death and suffering than from, say, just instant death via tree branch, crush the skull instantly? I mean, things like that. I mean, it might seem like a silly question, but I think it's important because we are dealing with an all-powerful being who supposedly would want to eliminate needless suffering, right? Like completely needless suffering that serves no purpose. What could possibly be the additional value that anyone could get from the fawn actually internally feeling pain versus just the same exact scenario, the fawn still dies in the same place even, yet it's killed in a less painful way?
Yeah, there's a couple things with Rowe's arguments that are interesting, because he sets it up in almost a way where he sets up parameters so tight that he can't possibly fail. So he's saying, well, no one observed this happen. No one knows that this happened, so no one can say, hey, we got to do more to get these deer out of here to make to make sure that that when we when we have lightning storms, that we have little alarms on trees that get deer out of the forest quicker or whatever. He sets it up in a way where no one sees this event take place. So it's almost, I wouldn't say logically contradictory, but he's saying no one sees the event take place, but I'm going to tell you that it took place. But
it's not hard to imagine something at least very much like that, right? I mean, we're talking about thousands of years. We're not even talking about humans. We're talking about millions of years of potential suffering anywhere in the entire world. Surely examples like that happened, right?
Maybe. I think...
Oh, man.
Hold on, because if you read his entire narrative about the deer, like a lot of the specific details, to me, is like, I guess it's possible. I'm not saying it's logically impossible or anything like that. But again, we go back to the part of, I can say we don't know why, but it's not logically impossible that there is a greater reason. And I agree, it's hard to think of a reason from moment one why that's the case. I think it's hard to think of a reason why, let's say a child gets hit by a car and dies. Like, that's hard to think about as well as to why, but I think a possibility can be brought about. And if that's the case, then there's nothing logically contradictory about it.
Then I have to ask you, is there any observable instance of suffering in our world that could possibly shake your faith in God then? I mean, is there such a thing as suffering so bad that you would say, no good? I mean, it sounds like your answer could apply to any suffering. I mean, we could literally all be feeling as much pain as possible right now, and it seems like your answer would still work. You'd just say, well, there's probably some good reason for that. Is there anything that would shake your faith on that?
Well, of course, there's... With that, say everyone's feeling the most amount of suffering they could possibly feel, and what I'm saying is that there's nothing logically contradictory about it. So of course it could work in various circumstances, but if you're asking if there's something emotionally that could shake my faith, I mean, I don't know. I haven't experienced the full gamut of things emotionally, but is it possible? Of course it's possible, but I just don't know. I mean, I can't put myself in that situation, and I think the good question to ask is what should change my faith, what should make me not believe in God, and there could be a couple answers to that I would entertain that I think would if something came about. But yeah, you're right. There could be a maximal amount of suffering in the world, and I could still say, well, it's not logically contradictory to God's existence because of, X amount of reasons. So.
Well, it's one thing to say that it's not logically impossible, but there are tons of things that aren't logically impossible. I mean, little space aliens could be manipulating me right now. It's not logically impossible, but it's unreasonable to believe that, I hope, about me. Do you guys believe that? Because it's definitely not true. I'm just telling you. Totally not true. I am not just a group of aliens in a skin suit. Definitely not. Anyway, do you see what I mean, though? There's a difference between logical impossibility and something that's reasonable to believe.
Yeah.
All right.
Well,
So
that comes to the distinction between. I mean, you guys have been going back and forth here a little bit about the logical problem of evil, and whether it is even a possible justifying reason, right? And of course, in the debate, I never defended the logical problem of evil. I've defended the inductive problem of evil, the evidential problem of evil, which says that not only is that almost certainly the fawn example something to have occurred before, it's almost certainly to have occurred millions and millions of times before. And if not in that exact circumstance, then in other circumstances where you run out of food and you starve to death slowly as an animal over days, or you get eaten alive, or and you die of infection over a long period of time. Like those instances of suffering are going to be the modus operandi of the natural world. It's just what happens. And I'm not saying that it's logically impossible for God to have justifying reasons for those kinds of events. I've merely claimed that there are other hypotheses that make way more sense of these kinds of things.
Rob, do you care to respond to that, or you want me to move on to another question?
Let's just move on. I think we can go back and forth on that all day, I think.
Okay. Justin, I've got a question for you here. I know you should be excited. Sorry.
Yeah.
So I'm highlighting it here. Mike McElroy asked, why should we expect God to intervene to prevent suffering? Why should our suffering have any kind of primacy in God's calculus?
Well, if we are assuming classical theism here, then at the very least we have a God that is not only morally perfect, but is also interested in our well-being. He's interested in other things, of course, too. It's not as though well-being must always trump in all possible circumstances any other goods that God might want to bring about. But there's certainly a reason for him to, however strong, for him to intervene at times and prevent suffering that is unjustified. And again, it might be the case that you can bring up a scenario where there is a reason where God would want to play hands off because there's some greater good being brought. But I'm sorry, at the end of the day, when we count up the billions and billions and billions of slow deaths in the natural world, it's just not plausible to me that every single one of them is positively related to some great good down the line. And so I think because of that, there's good reason to think that indifference much better explains these facts.
Did you want to respond, Rob?
Yeah, I guess one thing, if we're going to assume the Christian worldview here, then it kind of ties back to what I said in my opening, which was that the chief purpose in life on the Christian worldview, or even if you want to talk classical theism, I would, add to with Christianity, is that our main goal here is not to live a life of happiness without any suffering. I would argue that suffering and sacrifice are necessary parts of life, in that we are to spread the knowledge of God, not to live lives that are free of pain and the like. So if we understand that in the context of heaven is real, and there are certain people who go to heaven based on criteria of like faith, then to me suffering seems to dissipate and not really matter that much if there's something greater beyond this world.
This is a good opportunity to go to a Twitter question. Actually, most of these have been on the Google Hangouts Q&A, which is kind of a nice way to ask questions. But we also got some on Twitter hashtag. And at Russell T. Pot asked two. I think I'll kind of pose both these questions because they're free. They're free will related. I can't. Someone with a really dirty Twitter name should ask something, so I'd have to say it. That's like too good of a question. I gotta say no. He asks, is there free will in heaven? and is there evil in heaven? And tied to that also, because I know free will was a lot of Rob's explanation for some of these things. How do we determine that we actually have the kind of free will that Rob has described which is an explanation for some of the suffering?
The first question, is there free will in heaven? It probably won't surprise you that Christians disagree on this particular area. I do think that Christians have free will in heaven, and I think that's because we understand the depth and the turmoil that comes as a result of sin. So much like I don't think people can forfeit their salvation, I think that if we say, well, in heaven, the eternal conscious torment of hell would serve as a reminder to people about what sin is like, and we will have such a knowledge at the throne of judgment in the Bible that we have a better idea of how terrible and destructive sin is. So I do think there's free will in heaven, and I don't think that's different or incompatible with saying there won't be evil in heaven either, based on the things that have taken place in humanity and what we would call the end times or the last of the last days. So, in the second piece, what was the second question?
Sure, it's well, you've answered a lot of the challenges Justin's brought up with free will might be a justification. So he's asking, how do you know that we actually have that free will that you're saying is a justification?
I would say it would be properly basic. It's something that we can sense, and based on that, unless someone submits a defeater for it, then I think it would be properly basic to understand that we that we do have a legitimate choice between A and not A. So based on that, I think it's fair to say that we have free will as being properly basic. And if someone would like to bring a defeater for that, then we can interact with that.
Do you have anything to say on that, Justin?
I do, but that would be just so many more.
Yeah.
I mean, those are all questions that deserve, entire books to themselves. So.
And what we can do, if it's easier, if you just want to direct your question towards Justin, he can answer it, and then we can just move on, and we don't have to have cross if you don't want to, Justin or Thomas. It's fine.
Sure.
Oh, well, we're almost coming to the end of the Q&A. I mean, well, we could really go on all day with this, but
we have 8 hours.
yeah. I'm gonna max out the Google Hangout of 8 hours, and then I think we can just start another one, and then we'll be good, right? All right. I think I'll be honest. I think unfortunately I've run out of good questions submitted for Justin, so I'm gonna have to ask one more for Rob, and that's why I'm kind of trying to include both of you on these questions because of the balance and stuff.
Yeah.
But Rob, you mentioned the fall at one point, and someone has asked, Mike actually again has asked, I'll go ahead and select that in case it does anyone any favors. Do you believe in a literal fall of a literal Adam and Eve in a literal garden? If so, why are you even talking about natural laws working consistently? If science based on consistent natural laws leads to the story of the Garden of Eden being false?
Yeah, I think that's taking in a presupposition that cataclysmic event like the fall couldn't change natural laws. So I'm not saying that they're consistent insofar as they can never change. What I'm saying is that if there was a perfect setup in the world, and then something were to happen where it would be fall, and that is the new, not even new, but that's what we see, that's the world we're in, and that's the consistency that we have now. I guess I don't see how that couldn't be something prior that happened that would change the set of events for us in humanity.
So you'd essentially be saying that if somehow there were scientists around back then, the natural, if they were just going on what the natural laws are and observable laws, they would say there was a Garden of Eden, whereas now those have been changed by some event, so scientists say there wasn't?
Well, no, I think what a lot of people have trouble with, and this gets into another in-house debate with Christians, is this idea of young earth, old earth, was there death before the fall, and so on. I look at the fall as more of a spiritual thing with sin natures and the like, and I sort of lean towards the position that there still was death, animal death and the like, before what we would call the fall. So yeah, I do think there's a literal Adam and Eve, and I think the fall that normally I reference is more of a spiritual, but if someone picked up a young earth view, let's say, I think they could probably argue that somewhat successfully, but I look at it as more of a spiritual event, more than more than an earth-changing, life-shattering, laws are now upside down kind of event. So.
Okay, well, I think I'll put it to you both. We do have plenty more questions, but as I referenced, they're mainly for Rob. So I want to just ask you guys, would you prefer to wrap up with closing statements now? Do you want to keep grilling Rob with some questions? What would you guys like to do?
I think closing statements would be pretty fine. I don't want to make it a completely one-sided thing, and I think it's already been just because the nature of the questions have already been large.
Hey, I did my best to grill you. That's it. I'm going back to that question I asked, Jess. I'm going to grill you some more on that. All right. Well, with that said, thank everyone. I just thank you guys so much for the questions you submitted. I know obviously I couldn't get to all of them, but I think I got to a good number of them, and they were very good. So thanks. And with that, I would like to open up closing statements. And I will go toward Rob. I'll get my timer here just so that we don't go overboard. And Rob, you have 5 minutes, closing statements.
Oh, 5 minutes, all right. Well, first of all, I want to thank you for moderating, as well as Justin for participating again. I think what's interesting in the debate for me and things that I've learned is that we can express one particular view, and then as we get deeper and deeper, come into some unknowns where we don't particularly know the answer. That's one thing I kind of like about dialoguing with Justin, is that he's not a person where everything that he says is true and he knows the answer to everything, and that's why I kind of like that type of interaction, because some of the questions he asked, I don't have a certain answer for it, and it's an answer that it's good to go and research and find. But I think on the whole, as we look at probabilistic versions of the problem of evil and different types, I still think that if we adopt a Christian worldview, it makes more sense than what we see on naturalism, if we were to carry that view out to its logical conclusion, insofar as what we see with suffering being pretty much illusory to the point where it's not really objective. My second point was on, we looked at skeptical theism as well as various types of theodicies, where we would say that things like natural law, freedom, and moral responsibility supersedes that of suffering, and that it's necessary as a byproduct for that to exist. And the other part was skeptical theism, which we talked about in the context of Rowe's argument, which says, we don't know why an all-loving, powerful, and knowing God would allow suffering to take place. So, and Justin admitted that if we were to adopt that view, that first argument falls away. And lastly, one thing we didn't get a chance to talk about a whole lot, but I think is interesting, and even if you don't subscribe to it, interesting to at least consider, is the idea of Molinism and how that plays in to our lives as a add-on to free will, if you will, that God has middle knowledge, and logically prior to the decree, He has ordered the world as such, that His will is still accomplished and our free will is still intact. And there's much more deeper parts to that I'd like to express, but of course we're limited on time. The other thing I would like to encourage people listening to do is to actually have meaningful dialogue with people who you disagree with. I think, and I'm sure Justin would agree with me, is that a lot of times people prefer to respond in things and quips and just nonsensical statements and anger, and I think it would be a lot better for both sides if people just responded meaningfully and with sincere desires, rather than what I see most of the time, which is just people being really angry for no particular reason in general. So I think that would be really good for the dialogue between Christians and atheists, and probably all types of faith as well. But to conclude, I still don't see, I see merit in discussing the emotional problem of evil and why people react to certain situations the way they do. I think that's really good. But as far as the logical problem, I think that has been defeated. In the evidential problem, I don't think we have enough data to say one way or another where the evidence truly lies. So to me, it's still a push, but I'd definitely be willing to discuss it more moving forward, because I think it is a topic worth talking about a little bit more. So that's all I have for my closing. So again, I want to thank you guys for moderating and participating, and then the people for listening. So thank you.
Thanks, Rob. All right, Justin, 5 minutes closing.
Yeah, I won't take all 5 minutes. I don't really actually have anything planned, but I'll just say a few things here. Yeah, so I want to thank you, Thomas, and Rob for making this happen, and I enjoyed our discussion. I think I got to understand where Rob is coming from a little bit more, and because we've debated in the past, and so that I'm coming to understand Rob and his positions a bit more, which is always valuable, and. When it comes to the arguments that I presented this evening, I'm not entirely sure that they've been interacted with in a direct way. So there's been posits like additional details to theism to say, okay, maybe this is why posits being things like possible unknowns that we can appeal to. But of course, unknowns can be appealed to on both sides. I can say, just as Rob can say there are possible unknown reasons why God might allow the child to drown in the pool, I can easily come back and say, well, but Rob, there's a bunch of obvious, it's obvious that there's a bunch of unknown reasons, additional reasons why God would want to prevent that child from drowning. And so I think that appealing to unknowns in this way, at least in response to the arguments of the type that I brought out today, are largely irrelevant because they cancel each other out. The unknowns on each side cancel each other out, and you're left with the question of what hypothesis better explains the facts on the ground. And I think that, unsurprisingly, I think that in indifference, an atheistic hypothesis is going to do better, and it's going to have more explanatory power in its ability to explain those particular facts than theism, and even more so Christian theism. I think Christian theism has more baggage that makes it more problematic for its explanatory ambitions. But that said, I really enjoyed this conversation. So watch me on Real Atheology.
Hey, I was gonna get to that. I want to say so. Thanks, Justin. I think maybe it's possible you guys are just too nice. I think I need to get some participants who really hate each other, trying to crawl through the screen and attack more. No, that was great. I think that was really respectful dialogue, and I certainly learned a lot. I already knew all Molinism. Knew it, but no. So I want to thank you guys. Thank you, listeners, for watching so much. And as I referenced, I was going to say, find Justin Schieber on Real Atheology. Is there anything else you'd like to point people to?
No, not really. That's my main project going on. Reasonable Doubts is wrapped up, so that's where you'll find most of my content.
And you can find Rob on apologetics105.com and the podcast by that name. Anything you would like to promote, Rob?
I would like to promote reasonablefaith.org, just not as to say that that's an end-all, be-all for Christian thought, and that's what people need to engage in, but just for the other side, for people to examine someone who approaches it from a natural theological perspective, not a presuppositional one. So I think that would be good for people who are looking for atheists, who are looking for arguments from the other side.
Excellent. And of course, if you want to find my stuff, you can go to Atheistically Speaking, the podcast on iTunes. If you want to support more endeavors like this, you can go to patreon.com/atheist, and that'll support more endeavors like this debate, which was great. Thank you guys so much. I'm going to go ahead and call that a wrap. I hope to talk to you again soon, both Justin and Rob. Maybe, Rob, I can get you on the show sometime on another topic or something.
Sure.
All right. Thanks so much, guys. We are out.
See you guys.
Take care.